All right, so today we're going to be talking about sensation and perception, and we're going to be covering just some basic topics that fall under this category. It's a very broad category, but we're just going to be looking at a very general perspective at some of these topics. So we can kind of describe sensation and perception right off the bat. So sensation is the gathering of information from the senses for the brain to process. So let's say, for example, we have a hot stove. Let's just mark it here. Hot stove, and you put your hand on it by accident. The heat is going to trigger a response in your sensory neurons in your hand, and then that's just the raw sensation. The sensation is the the process of a stimulus stimulating your neurons in your hand, or it will in this example your hand, but it could be like your eyes, a taste bud in your mouth, ears, nose, etc., etc. And then perception is how the brain interprets the information from the senses. So you're going to put your hand on the hot stove, and then the neurons are going to travel up to your brain, or not the neurons, the nerve impulses, um, basically the message being relayed, and then that is going to trigger a response saying, ouch, that's hot. So your brain saying that's hot, that's going to be perception, how you perceive that sensory information. So throughout your day, you're going to be constantly bombarded with sensory information. Um, and sometimes we don't really necessarily need to process all that information. Or sometimes your body just can't really pick up on it. Um, and so that's called the absolute threshold. So when we talk about the absolute threshold, it's basically the amount of stimuli it takes to pick up on the sensory information being given. So let's say someone's behind you and you lightly touch their shoulder, and they don't really notice it. Um, the sensation is there, but your body just doesn't really pick up on it because it's just unnecessary to waste energy on processing that information. And then another thing to talk about is the difference threshold, which is the amount of change needed in order to detect that change. Um, so, for example, we have here a backpack um, on the right here, and let's say if I can draw, let's say it's like a really heavy backpack. You have a lot of books in there. You've been carrying it around all day, um, and you have a piece of paper, just one piece of paper, and you put it in the backpack. You're not going to notice a change in weight of the backpack because it's so heavy. Um, it doesn't really register that anything has really changed because yeah, it's heavy. One paper is really not going to do anything. Um, but let's see if I can draw it here um, with the little So let's draw a book real quick, a heavy textbook, and you already have a ton of books in there. You've been carrying around this backpack all day, and you put this textbook inside your backpack. You that heavy textbook's gonna make you realize that hey, this backpack has changed in weight because of the difference threshold. That would surpass the threshold, and yeah, you would notice the change. So that's really what these two things kind of correlate um, in terms of how we can kind of filter out some of um, these unnecessary stimuli. When we look at different types of processing, there's two types. There's top down and bottom up. And when I say processing, this is referring to the sensory the processing of sensory information. So top down is basically looking at the bigger picture and then breaking it down into smaller parts, into more basic parts. So we can get into the picture on the right in a little bit, um, but that's basically it for the top down processing. And then bottom up processing is kind of the opposite. It's the analysis of sensory information starting at the basic level and then building using those basic blocks into interpreting um, a, a bigger picture, or seeing the bigger picture. Um, so here on the right hand side, we have a picture, and immediately somebody could tell that there are faces hidden within the picture. Um, so if we can take a look at this, so we so on the bottom here, let's just break this down from bottom up. So we see we have in purple, we have a rock there, some more here, and if we kind of just look at those from, if we were referring to bottom up processing, we would say, oh, those are rocks. But then if we look at the whole picture, let me see if I can just erase this real quick. If we look at the bigger picture here, we can kind of see a face. You know, we see like the eyes, and then this looks like a nose. So that's just the basis of bottom down processing, or bottom up processing, excuse me, where you take the basic little things and then you build up from it. However, if we're talking about top down processing, we'd say, oh, that looks like a face. And then we start to notice, oh, that face is actually made out of little rocks and the shadows in the rocks. It's not actually a nose. And look, there's a mustache right here. Kind of funny. The lips. So just two different approaches of processing sensory information. Okay, so here are just some pictures that kind of have to deal with perception. So, if we take a look at this first one here, we see kind of a guy or a monster here chasing this guy over here, and obviously it seems like there's a big giant monster chasing this teeny tiny guy. However, if we take a closer look at it, the height of this guy is actually, it's hard to tell from here, but they're actually the same exact size. And how this picture is set up, we see in the beginning here, the roof of this tunnel is way up here to the floor where he's running here. So that makes it seem like he's a lot shorter. Whereas, since he's further back in the tunnel, the guy, this monster right here, the roof is here at this green dot, and then the floor is over here. So it's just little tricks like that to make it seem like this guy in the back is larger than this guy in the front, which has to deal with perception and how your eyes perceive depth. So, moving on, this one here, just quickly, these lines are actually parallel to each other, despite the fact it may look like it's going at an angle, and that's because these lines, these checkered boards, are not lined up with one another, which gives it the effect that it's off-centered. And then this bottom picture here, just another top-down, bottom-up processing kind of picture here. So the bridge, we have some sort of rock here as the nose, this tree outlining his face or his bald head, some hair on the side. So just some things like that. Alright, so nowadays on the TV, radio, any kind of media, you always see types of ads. And so let's just say, for instance, you're watching a TV show, minding your own business, and then, a flash of an ad comes on just for like a split second. And in that split second, it actually interrupts the processing of whatever you were just watching. And so now that advertisement, that flash of advertisement, is now subliminally in your brain. And that's sort of what priming is, or a quick little sketchy example of that. So how we would define priming is just a way to possibly manipulate a perception by being exposed to subliminal sensory stimulation. So just basically, you don't really know that you're being exposed to this information, or you don't recognize it, and that can possibly manipulate a perception or an answer to a question. So if I asked you to think of a bird, like a bird you'd see outside your home, and one you might see in the springtime eating worms, and I'll give you a second to think about that. So if you were to say, if you were thinking a robin, that's because I strategically put pictures of robins earlier in the PowerPoint. So if that influenced your answer at all, that's basically what priming is. It's being exposed to something previously, subliminally, and then having that being able to manipulate an answer or a response. Alright, so here we have a diagram of the eye, and then the first thing I want to go over is the fovea right there, which is this little indent. And that is the central focus point of an image. So central focus point. And this is also where cones are particularly concentrated. And cones are the nerves, the nerve cells in your retina, which is this red little strip here on the inside. And these cones are very sensitive to light in detail, and actually not so much light, but detail and color. Those are the two main things that they're good at, and there's a very high concentration of them right there in the fovea. And just as a little side note, there are 6 million mil cones. So there's 6 million cones in your eye. However, there are 120 million rods. And rods are the other types of cells that help you see in low light situations. They're more of like light receptors, so they can't really process color the way cones can. Actually, they can't really process it at all. But it's more for like lighting situations. So another thing right here is, oh, that's a bad color. We'll use purple. So right there where the optic nerve meets the eye, optic nerve, that's actually a blind spot. And that's because the nerve meets the eye right there, there's no place for any rods or cones. So that is a blind spot because there's no receptor cells there. So yeah, and another important part of the eye that I want to go over are well, first of all, the lens. The lens is which is this little gray oval right here, and these tiny little muscles below and above it. And the lens helps focus images that are maybe farther away or close up, depending on the situation. And it helps focus that image, let me get a good color, onto the fovea right there. And actually, the image flips upside down in the middle here. It flips upside down. So what the fovea is seeing is an upside down image of whatever you're seeing, and then that gets that nervous or like the impulse there, or the message is sent to your brain, and your brain automatically fixes it for you. So that's why you can see right side up. When it comes to nearsightedness and farsightedness, that's when your eye is shaped either more of an arch or more linear. And depending on that, that can adjust the main focal point of the eye. So let's say nearsightedness, your focus point would be right here, that green line right there. But farsightedness would be over here somewhere, and that's obviously very dramatic. But see, if the vision was coming in, there's a little mismatch right here where it's not exactly pinpointed right on where it's supposed to be. Um, Whereas farsightedness, um, it would cross over and actually make it blurry over here. So those are just some different things that can happen with the eye, um, there. So moving on. So when we talk about parallel processing, it's basically a term used to describe our ability for our brain to process many things at once. So, for instance, um, say you see a bird flying in the air. There's a lot of things that actually go into um, your perception of that, and then yeah, just your your perception. So some things are color, motion, form, and depth, and all of those are actually called subdivisions. So let's just write that in real quick. Subdivisions. All right. So these four subdivisions make up our ability to process multiple things at once. So these are the four things that we kind of subconsciously focus on, the groups that we kind of categorize things into. So if you see the bird, what color is the bird? We look at the bird and we see, oh, it's a robin, so it has a red stomach and black feathers on top. So we see that. And on the motion, so the bird is flapping its wings in the air. So we see that. And just from that, we can kind of depict what that object may be. So black feathers on top, red belly. It's in the air. It's flapping its wings. The form is mainly the outline. So what shape does it take? So obviously a bird has a very animalistic or avian shape to it, with a small beak, a very iconic round belly. So just things like that tend to help us with our perception of things. And then the last one here is depth. So you can see shadows, indentations of the object flying in the air. So the wings obviously higher or farther away. One wing is farther than the other in your view. So things like that help us to determine our perception of the object that we're trying to see. In this case, it was the robin. Okay, so the last topic we're going to be covering here is some of the theories of how we see color. So the first one here is the trichromatic theory, and that basically says that any color can be made from the three quote primary colors, which is green, red, and blue, or red, blue, and green. And that's because if you look at it, the cones in our eyes, which are the cells in our retina that are sensitive to color, they're specifically sensitive to these three primary colors, which is, again, red, blue, and green. That's why you see sometimes on older TVs, they have, if you look really, really closely, they have the three colorways, the three little palettes of red, green, and blue. And then the other the other theory is the opponent process theory, which basically states that we see in sets of opposite or opponent colors, and these sets are red and green, black and white, and yellow and blue, or blue and yellow. So you see here, right to the right here. Let me just draw it in. Right there. That flag, obviously it looks like the American flag, it's set up like that. However, the colors are different. So if you actually stare at this image long enough, and then look away or close your eyes, you can actually see the appropriate color. So the yellow would turn blue, the blue would turn white or yellow, and then the black would turn white. So you would end up with the correct looking American flag. So that's just something to keep in mind when we're talking about these types of theories. And it actually is shown that these two theories kind of work together in a sense. So with that, that brings us to the end of the presentation, the general overview of sensation and perception and kind of how we perceive things visually. And I hope you guys all learned something or took something away from this. So thank you.